1 Peter chapter 4, verse 7 through 11. But the end of all things is at hand. Therefore be serious and watchful in your prayers. And above all things have fervent love for one another, for love will cover a multitude of sins. Be hospitable to one another without grumbling. As each one has received a gift, minister it to one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. If anyone speaks, let him speak as the oracles of God. If anyone ministers, let him do it as with the ability which God supplies, that in all things God may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom belong the glory and the dominion forever and ever. Amen. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. One of the most beloved fantasy novels and movies that came out in the early 2000s was The Lord of the Rings. It's about a young hobbit named Frodo who takes on an almost impossible task to bring the One Ring and destroy it in the fires of Mount Doom. Alongside him is his best friend, Samwise Gamgee, who honestly really is the hero of the story, but that is a debate for another time. And they set out on a journey to vanquish the evil that has plagued their land. It's a story of burden and sorrow and temptation. It's a story about wanting to turn back, give up, succumb to the pressures of the journey. And yet we have a moment when all looks lost, when all hope seemed distant. Samwise and Frodo are outside of Mount Doom. Frodo too weak to carry the burden that he has been given. And Samwise looks to Frodo and says, I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you and it as well. So up you get. Come on, Mr. Frodo. Sam will give you a ride. This morning, we're going to continue to unpack Peter's writings to a church undergoing rising persecution, tempted to turn back, and yet Peter's words of encouragement are not that he has carried the burden for us, but that Christ already has. That is what we've been looking at the past several weeks. We've been looking at this encouragement of why suffering is a part of the Christian identity and how our encouragement as believers to walk the way Christ walked in humility, suffering, obedience, because Christ is the one who has already walked it with us. But the story of Frodo and Sam is one about action. And so Peter's going to do the same. He's reminded believers not to give up, why we should have encouragement, but now he's going to give them practical application of how to live in the midst of suffering. Peter's audience was not people who may experience persecution. It was a church that was already undergoing persecution. See, Peter was experiencing his own type of persecution. He was in Rome, he was imprisoned, and he was writing this letter at the beginning of the time of Nero's persecution in Rome. And soon, Peter, likely several years after this letter, will be martyred and murdered under Nero's persecution. And so Peter knows what it's like to live in a culture that has persecution. And so he writes to these believers who are starting to feel the ramifications of what it means to be a follower of Christ. Next week, he will tell them to share in the sufferings of Christ. But this week, he's going to give them practical application. It is with this backdrop that Peter teaches them how to live. And he begins this with his phrase in verse 7, the end of all things is at hand. Obviously, there's a sense of urgency here that can be felt, but what it means needs a little unpacking. Almost all commentators and scholars believe that this urgent message is not a call for the end of the world. So it's not like Peter standing on a soapbox saying, the end is near. That's not the implication of this particular phrase. Instead, they all believe it describes a moment in which God is completing his work. One scholar says Peter sees the resurrection as the launch of God's new age. Therefore, the end is not a clock, but a kingdom that has already begun. Thomas Schreiner says that the end is near not in terms of timing, but in terms of God's redemptive plan having reached its final stage. This is indicated by Peter's use of the word telos to likely indicate a goal or purpose being fulfilled. To make this point clearer with the question, why is the believer to endure suffering? Because what God has started, God will finish. Because of God's kingdom, because it is here and being fulfilled, and because there is redemption for those who believe and trust and obey their King, we can live in the midst of suffering. And as encouraging as that may be, Peter recognizes how difficult this is for the Christian faithful. This morning, I'd like to walk us through 4 instructions that Peter gives to those enduring hardship and living as exiles. It's a way in which we walk, and what you'll notice is the first portion of the clause is relatively easy to do, but it is the second part of the clause that makes it more difficult. And what I have done is I've used a slash to show you where the first clause and the second clause are separated. So let's look at our first clause here. Be serious and watchful in your news headlines. Oh, I'm sorry, I totally messed that up. Let me try that again. Be serious and watchful in all your conspiracy theories. Oh, I did it again. Man, let me try it one more time. Be serious and watchful in your fear and anxiety. No, be serious and watchful in your prayers. It's as if the human heart has a built-in tendency to do the very opposite of what Peter is actually calling us to do. Instead of being serious and watchful in prayer, we often become serious and watchful in almost everything else. There's much I want to say about prayer, but I feel as if I need to also share with you this morning a pastoral caution of something that I see going on, not only through church history, but particularly in our culture today. See, throughout Christian history, there have been groups motivated by interpreting signs and calling for the end of the world. For example, the Montanists in the 2nd century, which, by the way, that didn't happen. We're still here 1,800 years later. But in the beginning of the 19th century, there seemed to be a fascination and increase in the apocalyptic type of thinking. The Miller Group in the 1800s predicted Christ's return in the 1843 and in 1844, what became known in that time as the Great Disappointment. Jehovah's Witnesses did the same in 1914, 1918, 1925, and 1975. If you lived in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, you know how wild that was with the conspiracy theories about the end times going on. So much so that Hollywood picked up on this in the early 2000s following the Y2K panic, and they started calling it the apocalyptic boom. Movies, TV shows, books, all about the end of the world. Very encouraging. Not only is there a growing fascination with the end of the world type of scenarios, but those continue today, but now with something that is much more detrimental, something called social media and the internet. A growing audience. And here's my concern, is the reception and really spread of the most recent ones is cause for concern at the easy acceptability that has been amongst certain subsets of Christianity. Last year in 2024, there was growing concern about a solar eclipse. You guys remember this one? And the path was going to go over cities called Nineveh. It was cause for massive concern, and the widely spread information on the internet had people all in a tizzy, even though, by the way, that wasn't true. That was factually untrue about the cities being named Nineveh, but it made for a good theory and it made for a good story. But it began to show just ripples and cracks in spiritual discernment within our culture. But that's not as concerning as the most recent one just a few months ago, when a man from Africa claimed to have a vision and called for one date of Christ's return and then called for another one after he got it wrong. It garnered so much attention that conservatively it's calculated that the content had billions of views that were spread online, whether it was his videos or followers' videos or influencers just trying to ride the algorithm. The reality is that too many professing Christians are more watchful and serious about the things that they hear on social media than they are actually in prayer. And so here's my concern. If Christians are supposed to represent the truth, why is it that Christians, albeit a subset, not all of them, are some of the most prone to conspiracy? While there's some statistical data for this, my concern is actually more anecdotal. We must be careful what we believe, what we say, what we spend our time doing, because the tendency of the human heart is to want answers to our present suffering and our present reality. Peter's audience that he's writing to wanted answers to their suffering. But we are called to not find those answers as we are watchful and serious in news headlines. We are called to find those answers not in speculation. We are called to find those answers in prayer. When has predicting the Lord's return ever produced dependence on God the way prayer is supposed to? In fact, I would actually argue it's the opposite. The worrying about and trying to decipher all the different details generally causes more panic, more concern, and more anxiety. And what is left after failed end times prophecies like we saw a few months ago is a wake of spiritually vulnerable and spiritually hurt people. I have a growing concern that this does not shape believers to become more prayerful, more loving, or more Christ-like. But instead, the fruit it tends to create is people have become more fearful, more reactive, more interested in deciphering the times as if knowledge or data was the issue. And because of the rampant spread of information on social media, potentially creating more targets of spiritual manipulation. Peter tells us to be watchful and serious in our prayers. Prayer is what stabilizes your soul. Prayer is what surrenders control to the Lord. Prayer is what builds trust in the character of God. Prayer is the thing that makes us more clear-headed, more hope-filled, and more grounded. Tim Keller writes it like this: prayer is the way to experience a powerful confidence in God, to feel and know the reality of God's love, and to receive his help in living every day. Peter's audience was experiencing rising persecution for following Christ. It would be easy to harp on all these different things and be focused in all these different areas, to be watchful and serious in all of these different political spheres that they were going through. But instead, Peter says to be watchful in your prayer. Prayer for them was a way of life. It was like a chisel that results in Christ-like formation. It is the conviction of the Holy Spirit that brings one to weep in repentance. And as one author writes, so that tears produce Christ in our hearts. So why does a church need prayer in times of suffering? It's because prayer is the very thing that keeps the Christian grounded in the midst of it. St. Gregory of Nyssa writes this: prayer is the refuge of the helpless, a treasury of calm, the source of happiness, a protection on the journey, and a fountain of refreshment. The question is for you, does that define the way you experience prayer currently? So what does it mean to be watchful and serious then? It means we are not distracted by the things that are going around us, but we are diligently seeking the Lord in prayer, praying through the scriptures. We are considering the attributes and characteristics of God, and we spend time thinking and meditating upon those things. It means that we look at God's beauty, goodness, and truth and how it impacts every single part of our life. It means that God is the first one that we run to in times of distress, and he's also the first one we acknowledge in times of triumph. We must be careful not to allow things to take the place of what Peter is asking us to do as exiles in the midst of suffering. We must, with much watchfulness and seriousness, pray. The second thing he tells us is, above all things, have fervent love for one another. Now here's the difficult part: for love will cover a multitude of sins. Peter loves to use the Old Testament. He quotes here directly from Proverbs 17 and Proverbs 10. Whoever covers an offense seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates close friends. And likewise, hatred stirs up strife, but love covers all offense. As we consider this morning and what love is, I need to tell you that love by nature requires sacrifice. Consider this: love that does not challenge us to sacrifice has more in common with loving yourself than it does the other person. A couple's wedding day is a great celebration of their commitment to love, but their love is actually demonstrated when things get difficult and there's tension in their marriage. When you consider love in the New Testament, it's almost always accompanied by this notion that true love is produced in tension. Consider 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not parade itself. It's not puffed up, does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not provoked, thinks no evil, does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. Let's consider this morning. What does it mean when love suffers long and is kind? It means you give up your need for immediate gratification, control, or quick fixes. What does it mean when it says love does not envy? It means that you have to lay down your comparison and your jealousy. What does it mean when it says that love does not boast or parade itself? Well, it means that you need to surrender the desire to be noticed or to be praised, but willingness just to do good and have integrity. What does it mean that love is not proud or puffed up? It means that you need to let go of the need to be right all the time. What does it mean for love to not dishonor or to be rude? It means there must be a restraint of your words and sarcasm. What does it mean for love to not be self-seeking? Well, it means that there needs to be a laying down of our own personal preference for the good of others. What does it mean for love to not be easily angered or provoked? Well, it means to give up your right to react and your right to have vengeance. What does it mean for love to keep no record of wrongs? Well, it means you need to release bitterness and not have an eternal scorecard that you bring back up the next time there's a fight. What does it mean that love does not delight in evil? Well, it means to reject the pleasure of gossip and seeing others fall. Covering offenses is an expression of sacrificial love. This might mean that you may need to bear the emotional weight of having to forgive someone who has done wrong to you. It might mean resisting the urge to gossip, retaliate, or demand justice. It might mean having to trust God to handle the ultimate justice. Ultimately, this mirrors the love of Christ. St. Clement of Rome writes this: who can describe the bond of love of God? What man is able to tell the excellence of its beauty as it ought to be told? The height to which love exalts is unspeakable. Love unites to God. Love covers a multitude of sins. Love beareth all things, is long-suffering in all things. There's nothing base. There's nothing arrogant in love. Love admits of no schisms. Love gives rise to no sedition. Love does all things in harmony. By love have all the elect of God been made perfect. Without love, nothing is well-pleasing to God. In love has the Lord taken us to himself. On account of the love he bore us, Jesus Christ, our Lord, gave his blood for us by the will of God, his flesh for our flesh and his soul for our souls. See, the difficulty for Peter's listeners and for us today is that we like to love when it is suitable for us, when it costs us nothing, and when there is no demand for a sacrifice. But is that really true love? Peter reminds his audience, who will begin to experience ever-growing persecution, they are to continue to love even if it costs them everything. The next time you find yourself in a difficult moment in your marriage or workplace or friendship or relationship or whatever situation it may be, there is always a way in which you can demonstrate love, but it's going to cost you something. The next thing he tells us is to be hospitable to one another without grumbling. That's the difficult part. And honestly, this one is not only the hardest for me, but was also the most surprising for me as I was walking through this text. While it's difficult for me, and I've shared this before, is that I love my grass at my house. I'm very proud of it, but don't come visit me right now because it looks terrible. All right, I'm embarrassed of it. But the neighbor kids will come over, they'll dig up my dirt, they'll run up and down my grass, and heaven forbid, they'll play football in cleats. And there are times I'll come in and I'll complain to Amber and I'll say, why do we have to be the house that all the kids in our neighborhood want to come to? Can I tell you what that reveals about my heart? I don't value relationships as much as I do my grass. Philippians 2 tells us to do nothing with selfish ambition, but in humility count others more significant than yourself. When the neighbor kids come trample on my grass, it's a moment for me to look past personal cost and embrace Christ-like hospitality. Because true hospitality without grumbling comes from a heart surrendered to the Lord, a heart willing to sacrifice personal comfort, a heart that values others more than itself, a heart that delights in serving others as an expression of Christ's love. And my illustration is very silly in comparison to what these Christians that Peter is writing to. See, Peter's writing to Christian groups spread across Asia Minor. They're socially marginalized, they're economically pressured. In chapter 2, it tells us they're being slandered as evildoers. They're being insulted for Christ's name, and some are facing imprisonment and mob hospitality. In that time, in that world, opening your home was not casual. Hospitality actually exposed you. If you house Christians or traveling missionaries or anyone associated with the faith, your home became a target. One scholar notes, hospitality could jeopardize a Christian household by associating it with a stigmatized movement. Another writes, to welcome others into your home was to welcome their persecution. What Peter is sharing and telling the believers is to show hospitality to another without grumbling means to tend to somebody's needs in such a way that you aren't concerned about what it's going to cost you, how it may inconvenience you, or how lowly you must become to serve. Hospitality reveals what you value. Peter is not necessarily rejecting baking a casserole or keeping your house ready for a guest. Those are all good things to do with hospitality. I think what Peter's trying to do is give the believer no excuse. because of what I'm going through means that I am exempt from being called to show hospitality. Or in other words, there is no excuse so foolproof that will excuse the Christian from their duty to tend to the needs of those around them, even at their own inconvenience. We avoid hospitality by saying things like, my house isn't clean enough, I don't have time, the kids will mess up my grass, it's too stressful to have people over, people are too draining, I like my routine. All those reveal values that we find better or more valuable to us than actually the relationships we can build and serving one another. Lastly, Peter calls us to be good stewards of the gifts that he has given us. And here's the very difficult part. It's actually being a good steward of the gifts he's given us. He's going to describe good stewards that use their gifts. They use it for the glory of God. They use it to serve others. And he divides these gifts into two categories, into teaching and to serving gifts. When we try to answer the question, why does Peter believe that those in the church should be using their gifts amidst suffering? We actually need to ask another question, and it's this: what does it actually mean to be a good steward at all times? Due to time, I won't be able to read the whole entire parable of the talents, but in Matthew chapter 25, we get a parable from Jesus. A man was going on a journey and he called his servants, giving them ownership of some of his finances. To one he gives 5, to one he gives 2, and to another he gives 1. And then he leaves. After some time, he comes back, and the one who was given 5 talents says, here, master, I have gotten 5 more. Now I have 10 to give back to you. And he says, good and well done, faithful servant. Enter the joy of your master. The one with the 2 talents does the same thing. He's able to get 2 more based off the 2 that was entrusted to him. And the master says, well done again. But the one who was given 1 talent went and hid it. And so he comes back and he says, master, I was afraid, I did nothing, but here's your 1 talent back. And Jesus responds, you wicked and lazy servant, you should have at least invested it. The servant's fear led to an action. Today, many reject God's call to serve because they prioritize comfort, schedule, personal gain, independence, or they see that their own suffering is more important than using their gifts. Listen, this is not to diminish the things that we go through. And this is not to say there are seasons of rest that believers may need to have after enduring long suffering. But as believers who are undergoing suffering here, it was important for them to remember that there's no amount of fear, rejection, or suffering that should keep them from using their gifts for others. Whether it's teaching gifts or service gifts, they are not meant for the individual. God has given every believer in this room a gift, not for you, but for another person, for the body to be used. In fact, if you're currently not using your gifts anywhere, then you may have more in common with the servant who had the 1 talent than you do with the one that had 5 or 2. Our goal as believers is to hear what the master said to the other 2, well done, good and faithful servant. See, the beautiful part of Peter's instruction to these people who are enduring suffering is that it models Christ's own character and action. As we consider the beginning of Advent today, the start of the Christian calendar, as a season of anticipation, we also remember that we've just concluded the Christian calendar. Often it is known for reflecting upon Christ being our King. So considering this for a moment, our King, he lived a life of prayer. His love covered a multitude of offenses. He was hospitable and never complained, nor did he care what other people thought as he cared for the marginalized, the poor, the oppressed, and the sinner. Consider this, our King modeled all of these instructions while he was on his way to the cross. He prayed in the garden. He loved so much that he was willing to endure beatings as he carried his cross all the way up to the hill of Golgotha. He pardoned a criminal and welcomed him into his kingdom while he was dying there. And he became the suffering servant on the cross, perfectly executing his gifts as prophet, priest, and king. Because Christ has been raised, because we have a future and a hope and a glory, we dedicate our lives now to prayer, to love while sacrificing, while we tend to the needs of others without complaining or without excuse. And we serve God and others as he gives us provision to do so. That is Peter's instruction to a suffering church.